April 12, 1945. Baguio, Philippines. The humid morning air hung heavy over a makeshift compound where 24 Japanese women knelt in the mud, their hands pressed tightly together in prayer. Their uniforms were tattered, stained with the grime of weeks spent hiding in caves, and their heads were bowed low. But they were not praying for rescue. They were praying for death. The sky above them was the color of ash, a grim reflection of the burning city nearby, and in the distance, the guttural sound of American voices echoed through the damp air. This was the end they had been explicitly taught to expect, swift, brutal, and final. Before we unravel this extraordinary story of humanity in the face of total war, if you find value in these untold chapters of history, please like this video and subscribe. Your support helps keep these forgotten stories alive. The women listened intently to the sound of boots approaching heavy, purposeful American boots squelching through the mud. Lieutenant Yoshiko closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing against the terror rising in her throat. She had ordered the others to face death with the dignity of soldiers of the emperor, yet her heart hammered violently against her ribs. Vivid images from propaganda films flickered through her mind like a nightmare on a loop. American soldiers laughing as they bayonet helpless prisoners. Villages set ablaze with flamethrowers. A ruthless enemy that gave no quarter. The footsteps stopped. The compound gate swung open with a rusty screech. But when Yoshiko dared to look up, the Americans were not leveling rifles at them. They were carrying crates, food crates, medical supplies, and blankets. In that suspended moment, kneeling in the Philippine mud, the foundation of their reality cracked. These women realized that everything they had been told was a lie. The story of these 24 Japanese women prisoners of war in a conflict that rarely acknowledged female combatants is one history barely remembers. No major textbooks document their names, and no Hollywood films dramatize their ordeal. Yet, their experience reveals something profound about the machinery of war, the power of propaganda, and the stubborn persistence of human decency in humanity's darkest hours. To understand how these women came to kneel in the mud expecting execution, we must step back 6 months into the bloody theater of the Pacific War. In October 1944, American forces under General Douglas MacArthur returned to the Philippines, fulfilling his famous promise. The Japanese garrison, which had occupied the island since 1942, was now fighting a desperate, disorganized defensive campaign. Among the 30,000 Japanese troops scattered across the mountainous terrain of Luzon were approximately 200 women nurses, communications officers, administrative clerks, and comfort station managers. Japanese military doctrine in 1944 was unambiguous about the shame of capture. The Senjinkan, the military code issued to all Imperial forces, stated clearly, "Do not live to experience shame as a prisoner." This was not merely a rule. It was a spiritual mandate. Officers carried cyanide capsules tucked into their collars. Soldiers were trained to use grenades on themselves rather than surrender. The concept of surrender was so foreign to Japanese military culture that the word itself, kozen, carried connotations of ultimate, irrecoverable disgrace. 4 Japanese women in uniform, the stakes were even higher. The military propaganda machine had done its work effectively, convincing them that American soldiers were not just enemies, but barbaric savages who raped, tortured, and murdered female captives without mercy. These were not idle fears manufactured from nothing. They were deliberate psychological constructions designed to prevent surrender and ensure that every soul, regardless of gender, fought to the death. Japanese newsreels had shown staged footage of American atrocities, and officers repeated these dark fables until they hardened into absolute truth. By March 1945, as American forces pushed relentlessly into the mountainous Baguio region, the Japanese defensive perimeter finally collapsed. The orderly retreat disintegrated into chaos. Most Japanese troops vanished into the dense jungles to wage a hopeless guerrilla war. But approximately 24 women nurses from a field hospital, 3 communications officers, and administrative staff found themselves cut off from the main force. They were stranded in no man's land, isolated from their commanders and the grim certainty of their orders. For 3 weeks, They existed as ghosts, hiding in the shadows of abandoned buildings and damp limestone caves. They survived on foraged roots, insects, and contaminated water. Sergeant Macho Tanaka, 31 years old, had served as a surgical nurse in Manchuria before her deployment to the Philippines. She was a hardened veteran, yet she kept a diary, fragments of which miraculously survived the war. On March 28th, she wrote with trembling hands, "We have no food, no medicine. Fumo is burning with fever. At night we hear American patrols passing nearby. Each night I think tomorrow they will find us. Tomorrow it ends." The capture, when it finally arrived, came not with the bang of a rifle, but with the whimper of exhaustion. On April 1st, an American patrol discovered the women huddled in a collapsed warehouse on the outskirts of Baguio. Private First Class Robert Chin, a Nisei soldier at Japanese-American serving as an interpreter, was with the patrol. His presence added a layer of surreal complexity to the encounter. The face of the enemy looked just like their own brothers. His account, recorded in a 1982 oral history interview, describes the scene with haunting clarity. They were in the corner, huddled together like frightened animals, he recalled. Their uniforms were torn. Some were barefoot, feet bleeding. When they saw us, they did not run. They just closed their eyes and started praying. I thought they were praying for mercy. Later, I realized they were praying for death. The women were transported to a temporary detention compound just outside the ruined city. It was not a traditional POW camp. American forces were advancing too rapidly to establish permanent facilities. It was simply a guarded perimeter consisting of a few tents and a water source. The women were given a designated space to sleep and minimal rations, rice porridge twice daily, occasionally supplemented with dried fish. The American guards, mostly young infantrymen from the 33rd Division, had absolutely no training in handling female prisoners. Most had never seen a Japanese woman soldier before and watched them with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. The standing orders were simple: secure the perimeter, prevent escape, and maintain basic humanitarian standards as outlined in the Geneva Convention. But standing orders said nothing about what to do when prisoners refused to eat because they believed the food was poisoned. For the first week, the women barely touched their rations. They were convinced the Americans were merely fattening them up before the real torture began, a psychological torment worse than starvation. Nurse Fumiko Sato, 26, later recalled through an interpreter, "We thought they were playing with us like cats with mice. We waited each day for the game to end." Malnutrition and disease spread quickly. Several women contracted dysentery, and Fumiko's fever worsened into pneumonia. They were not soldiers anymore. They were ghosts waiting to fade, clinging to the only certainty they had left, that the enemy was a monster. The compound itself was a study in jarring contrasts. Outside the wire, American supply trucks rumbled past in a cloud of dust, carrying ammunition and crates of Spam to frontline units. Inside, 24 women existed in a suspended state between life and death, clinging to the grim certainty that Americans showed no mercy. Then came April 12th, the day the timeline of their lives split in two. Captain William Morrison, 34, had been a high school history teacher in Portland before the war. He had landed at Leyte Gulf in October and fought his way north through some of the bloodiest combat in the Pacific Theater. He had seen men die in ways that would haunt him forever and had learned to compartmentalize, to see the enemy simply as the enemy, a faceless obstacle to be removed. But when he visited the detention compound that morning for a routine inspection, that mental wall crumbled. He did not see enemy combatants. He saw starving, terrified women who looked like they had already died inside. Morrison's interpreter, Private Chun, explained the situation in a hushed tone. "They believe they are being held for execution, Captain. They think the meager rations are poisoned or a trick. They are waiting for the torture to start." Morrison stood there in the bright morning sun, looking at 24 human beings who had been so thoroughly dehumanized by their own propaganda that they could not recognize mercy when it was staring them in the face. He made a decision that was not in any field manual. He turned to his supply sergeant. "Get me breakfast," he said. The sergeant blinked. "Rations, sir." Morrison shook his head. No. Real breakfast. Everything we have got. Within an hour, soldiers returned with crates from the division supply depot. The smell hit the compound first ascent these women had not experienced in months, perhaps years. It was the rich, impossible aroma of fresh bread, canned meat, sugary fruit cocktail, and strong coffee. The American soldiers' pride opened the wooden crates in the center of the muddy compound. Corporal James Rodriguez, just 22 years old, watched the women's faces. They just stared. He later wrote in a letter to his sister, like they could not believe what they were seeing. One of them started crying, then another. Then they were all crying. I have never seen anything like it. Sergeant Mitchell was the first to move. She stood slowly, her legs shaking from weakness, walked to the crates, and picked up a heavy can of corned beef. She turned it over in her hands, examining the label, then looked up at Captain Morrison with piercing eyes. She spoke a few sharp words in Japanese. Private Chin translated. She is asking if it is poisoned. Morrison did not speak. He gently took the can from her hands, opened it with his pocket knife, dug out a large chunk of meat, and ate it himself. He swallowed, smiled, and handed the can back to her. "Tell her it is real," he said softly. "Tell her they are not going to die today." That simple act broke the dam. The women surged forward not frantically, but with careful, deliberate movements born of reverence. They took the food slowly, as if it might vanish into smoke. Some sat down right in the mud and ate with their hands. Others brought food back to the sick women who could not stand. Private Yuki Harada, 19, the youngest of the group, picked up a chocolate bar and held it like a sacred object. "I thought I was dreaming," she later said through an interpreter. "I thought I had died, and this was some kind of afterlife. I could not understand why our enemies, the monsters, were feeding us." But food was only the beginning. Over the next 3 days, Captain Morrison requisitioned crates of medical supplies that were strictly earmarked for American infantry. An Army medic examined Fumiko, listening to the rattle in her chest with a stethoscope that felt cold against her feverish skin, and immediately started her on sulfa drugs to combat the pneumonia. Canvas cots replaced the muddy ground, elevating the women out of the filth. A loud, chugging water purification unit was trucked in, providing clear drinking water for the first time in weeks. The compound transformed from a holding area for the damned into something resembling an actual prisoner of war facility. The change in the women was gradual but visible. They began eating regularly, and color returned to their gaunt faces. The constant, vibrating tension that had gripped the compound began to ease, but the psychological transformation was slower and far more complex. Lieutenant Yoshiko struggled with it most. She had been trained as an officer, conditioned to lead, to maintain discipline, and to uphold the emperor's honor at all costs. But what was honor when your enemy fed you? What was discipline when your own military had abandoned you to starve while the barbarians treated your wounds? She had spent 3 years believing Americans were monsters. Now, those monsters were teaching her English words and offering her clean bandages. The Americans were struggling with their own contradictions as well. These were enemy soldiers, Japanese soldiers. This was the same military that had bombed Pearl Harbor, that had committed unspeakable atrocities across Asia, and that had killed their friends in brutal battles from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. Yet here they were, sharing cigarettes and chocolate, teaching card games, and showing crumbled black and white photos of families back home. Corporal Rodriguez found himself in a heated philosophical debate with another soldier, Private Eddie Walsh, while on guard duty. "I still do not get it," Walsh said, gesturing with his rifle toward the tents. "We are supposed to kill them on the battlefield, but here we are supposed to be nice. Where's the line?" Rodriguez thought about it for a long moment, watching a nurse help a Japanese woman walk. "Maybe there is not a line," he said. "Maybe that is the point." By the end of April, something extraordinary had developed in the compound. It was not quite friendship. The gulf of war was too wide for that, but it was something more significant: recognition. Recognition that the enemy was human. Recognition that humanity persisted even when everything else failed. The Japanese women began teaching the American guards basic Japanese phrases. The Americans taught them English in return. One afternoon in early May, a sudden, violent tropical downpour sent everyone scrambling for shelter. Private Yuki ended up diving under a canvas tarp with 3 American soldiers. They sat there in the sudden intimacy of the storm, watching the rain hammer the earth, turning the world gray. Someone passed around a pack of Lucky Strikes. For 20 minutes, they were not enemies. They were just people sheltering from a storm. When the rain stopped and the sun broke through the clouds, Yuki looked at the soldiers and said in halting English, "Same rain, same sky." One of the soldiers, Private Danny O'Brien, nodded slowly, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Same rain." It was a small moment, easily forgotten in the grand sweep of history, but it represented something monumental, a crack in the absolute certainties that war demanded, and a glimpse of the world as it actually was. The war in the Philippines was effectively entering its death throes by late May. The Japanese defensive positions had utterly collapsed, leaving surviving forces scattered in the mountains, cut off from supply and command. On May 8th, Germany surrendered, and though the news took days to reach the remote Philippine compounds, the shift in the air was palpable. The Pacific War was grinding toward its final, violent phase. Captain Morrison received orders to transfer the women prisoners to a larger POW facility in Manila. The makeshift compound would be dismantled. The Americans were moving north. The brief, strange community that had formed in the mud was about to dissolve. The night before the transfer, Morrison gathered the women and explained through Private Chen what would happen. They would go to Manila. They would receive proper medical care. Eventually, when the war ended, they would be sent home to Japan. The women listened in silence, their faces unreadable in the twilight. Sergeant Micho finally spoke, her voice quiet but firm. Private Chen translated. "She is asking if you will be there." "In Manila." Morrison shook his head slowly. "No. My unit is moving out. Different direction." Micho nodded slowly. Then, she did something that silenced the entire compound. She bowed formally, deeply from the waist. The other 23 women followed in perfect unison. It was not a gesture of submission to a conqueror. It was a gesture of profound respect, of gratitude, of recognition between equals. Morrison, uncomfortable with the formality, but moved beyond words, returned the bow awkwardly. "You deserve to be treated like human beings," he said, his voice thick. "I am glad we could do that much." The next morning, trucks arrived to transport the women to Manila. As they prepared to leave, the lines between captor and captive blurred one last time. Lieutenant Yoshiko shook Captain Morrison's hand, a breach of every protocol she had ever known. "You showed us," she said in careful, practiced English, "that everything we were told was wrong." Morrison nodded, gripping her hand. "Maybe that is the real victory," he said, "learning that the enemy is just people." The women arrived in Manila on May 12th and were processed into a massive facility housing several hundred Japanese prisoners. It was efficient, with proper barracks and an infirmary, but something was lost in the transition. The intimacy of the small compound, the daily, unscripted interactions that had humanized both sides, was replaced by cold, institutional routine. The psychological aftermath surfaced slowly. Nurse Fumiko found herself struggling with nightmares, where the Americans were once again the monsters of propaganda. Lieutenant Yoshiko faced a crisis of identity. Her army had abandoned her, yet the enemy had shown her honor. Then came August 15th, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over the radio, announcing the unthinkable, Japan's surrender. The war was over. In the Manila facility, the news brought a chaotic mix of relief, grief, and confusion. Sergeant Micho stood listening to the broadcast, tears streaming down her face. She was not sure if she was crying for the defeat of her nation or the survival of her soul. She thought of Captain Morrison and the breakfast in the mud. They had won more than the war. They had proven that even in the total chaos of global conflict, compassion could survive. Repatriation took months. The women from the Baguio compound waited in Manila, writing letters home that they were not sure would ever be delivered, struggling to articulate truths that contradicted every narrative their country held dear. Finally, in November 1945, They were placed on a US Navy transport bound for Japan. As Lieutenant Yoshiko walked up the gangplank, carrying her few possessions, Captain Eleanor Hayes, the Army psychologist, asked her a final question. "What will you tell people when you get home?" Yoshiko stopped and looked back at the ruined skyline of Manila. "I will tell them," she said, her voice steady, "that the enemy taught me more about honor than my own commanders did." 12 days later, the ship docked at Uraga Harbor. The Japan they returned to was unrecognizable. The cities were charred skeletons of wood and ash, the result of relentless firebombing. The people were starving, their eyes hollow with defeat. Returning home was, in many ways, harder than captivity. The social stigma of being a prisoner of having survived when one was expected to die hung over them. Sergeant Micho returned to her village near Hiroshima, which lay half destroyed. Her family was alive, but they urged her to stay silent about the war, to bury the shame of survival. But Micho could not stay silent. She found work in a local clinic, telling patients about the American captain, who had brought them breakfast instead of bullets. Some doubted her sanity, but others listened. One old doctor, wrapping a patient's wound, told her, "Maybe that is how we rebuild. Not with weapons, but with the courage to see the enemy as human." Lieutenant Yoshiko reunited with her husband, a naval officer who had survived the sinking of his ship. Their first conversations were painful, filled with the silence of unshared trauma. He had fought Americans with hatred, while she had learned to see them as saviors. Slowly, painfully, they found common ground in their exhaustion and a shared desire for peace. Private Yuki, only 20 years old, struggled the most to reintegrate. She had known only war since her teenage years. Yet, she found a strange purpose teaching English in Yokohama. When her students asked where she had learned the language of the conquerors, she answered simply, "From the enemy. They taught me that enemies can become teachers." In 1947, 2 years after the guns fell silent, 15 of the original 24 women gathered for a reunion in a small, dust-choked restaurant in Tokyo. Over a modest meal of rice and tea, a far cry from the feast Morrison had provided, they toasted to survival. Yoshiko raised her cup first. "To survival." Fumiko, the nurse, added softly, "To the men who showed us that survival could be honorable." Yuki whispered, "To second chances." And Micho finished, "To remembering. So we never forget what humanity looks like, even in war." The reunions dwindled over time as life claimed them. In 1982, historian Thomas Nakamura tracked down Micho, then 73 years old. She showed him her diary, the pages yellowed and brittle. "The Americans brought us food," she told him, running her finger over the entry from April 12th. "How do we make sense of enemies who feed us? The worst lies of war make us see others as less than human. The truth is much harder to accept." Captain Morrison, interviewed shortly before his death, remembered the event with characteristic humility. He did not see himself as a hero. "We gave them breakfast instead of a bullet," he said. "That is all. No medals, no headlines. Just a quiet morning where we decided to be human." Today, there's no grand monument to the events at the Baguio compound. Only a small stone in a Tokyo cemetery and the fading memories of a few families. But the story remains a powerful testament to the idea that even in the deepest valleys of conflict, compassion is a choice. A choice that can break the cycle of hate and prove that, in the end, we all stand under the same rain, looking up at the same sky.